Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean text and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 152 of Lucretius Today. We're continuing the discussion of the background of the Epicurean school using Norman DeWitt as an organizational method. And this week we're talking about chapter 6, the new education. And we're beginning with the discussion about Epicurean education. The Epicurean approach towards teaching people was a reaction to, and to some extent in response to, the method that was in place at the time that the school was started, which primarily was the Platonic method, which consisted of music and gymnastic, inherited from the Athenian past, of rhetoric, which had been introduced by the sophists, and of dialectic and mathematics, especially geometry, which was the addition of Plato himself. In this chapter today, as we're discussing the new education, and from here on out, we're hitting major issues in each chapter that are going to be significant in Epicurean philosophy. And with the new education, we're dealing with, for example, the issue that Epicurus is perceived as an enemy of culture, as we've discussed numbers of times in the past. And so therefore, what we need to do is look at what was existing as culture at the time that Epicurus started teaching. And when we go through these elements that DeWitt has just mentioned, especially music and gymnastic, and music being related to poetry, that's an area of expertise that Joshua has. And so whenever that subject comes up, I like to hear what Joshua has to say about Epicurus's attitude towards music and poetry and the way we should take that.
Yeah, there's a line in here, Cassius, that really stands out to me. It's this second paragraph where he says, the Platonic program consisted of music and gymnastic, inherited from the Athenian past. And it's those two in particular that I want to talk about, because there's a book that was written right about the time that Epicurus lived, actually, by a Greek general, acquaintance of Socrates, this guy named Xenophon. And the book is called Anabasis, which I guess in Greek means upcountry march. So very briefly, I'll give you the story, and then I'll try and get to the point. And the general story of this book is that you've got the Persian king, whose name escapes me at the moment, I think it was Darius II, was on his deathbed. So he called his two sons, of which the eldest was Artaxerxes and the youngest was Cyrus. So he calls his two sons and he tells them, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm about to die. This is how I want to dispose of the kingdom when I'm dead. So Artaxerxes, you'll be the high king in Babylon. Cyrus, you're going to have this other area here that you'll be in charge of, much smaller area. Okay, so then he dies and Artaxerxes takes the throne. Artaxerxes is convinced by one of his courtiers that Cyrus is plotting against him, so he has him imprisoned, which is quite possibly the worst thing he ever did, because even though Cyrus was innocent of the charge that was laid against him, when he was finally freed by his brother, he vowed personally to himself never again to be under his control. So for the next several years, he began slowly consolidating his position with the eventual goal of marching on Babylon and deposing his brother and taking the throne for himself. To that end, one of the things he did was he hired a Greek mercenary army of somewhere between 12 and 14,000 Greek soldiers. And Xenophon, the guy who wrote the book, was in the army. This is an absolutely true story and a very fascinating one at that. The Greek army goes to Persia under the pretext that they will be used to put down some insurrection on the border, I think the northern border of Persia, or some little minor dispute is what they believe that they've been called there to do. It's only as they begin to march and they're marching in the wrong direction that they begin to realize they've been lied to. But Cyrus convinces them. He says, I'll double your pay, I'll triple your pay, whatever it is. He convinces them to stay and fight. And in any case, they can't really turn back now because the whole might of the Persian cavalry is behind them and is beginning to get a niggling sense of what's actually going on here. So what they do is they actually march on Babylon. There is a great battle in the field outside the city walls. The Greek army is victorious. They beat the Persian garrison at Babylon. But unfortunately, Cyrus is killed in the battle. So the guy who had hired them is now dead, and the Persian cavalry is coming up behind them very quickly. So in an effort to decide what to do, because after the battle there was a parley, some of their generals had actually been killed under the flag of truce. So they elect new generals. And one of these new generals that they elected was Xenophon, the guy who wrote the book. And what they quickly determined to do is, you can't turn around and go back the way you came, because that's the way the Persian cavalry are coming up the road. So what we need to do is to get north as quickly as possible to the Greek colonies on the coast of the Black Sea. And so the whole rest of the book, the bulk of the book, is actually this long, arduous, difficult march across the whole length and breadth of Persia to get the Greek army to safety. It's a fascinating read. I'd recommend it to literally anybody. It's one of my favorite books from the Greek world. But what was so interesting to me as I read it is what happened when the Greek army finally crested the hill and reached the sea. They've reached safety, because once you've reached the sea, you can find a Greek city, you can get a boat, and you can go back home. So this is, for the first time in months, they've realized, okay, we're probably actually going to survive this. So what they do, very strangely, from my point of view at the time when I first read it, was in celebration, they decided to hold a series of games, gymnastic contests, running contests. It's this outpouring of Greek culture, Greek talent, Greek interest. And it's absolutely fascinating. And what you feel when you read this book in that particular moment is the sheer relief of these soldiers who, by all rights, probably ought to have died, but managed to survive. And in the moment of survival, decided to celebrate their survival in a uniquely Greek way to do it. So when DeWitt says here in the second passage of this chapter that the Platonic program consisted of music and gymnastic inherited from the Athenian past, and that Epicurus himself will go on to endorse both of those aspects of the Platonic curriculum, I think he's absolutely right. And it's one of the most interesting parts of Greek culture. The whole dating system of Greek culture is the Olympiad, the Olympic Games. It's a very different way of looking at things, but a very interesting one.
Joshua, that's a fascinating story, and it reminds me of a couple of things. Basically, you're focusing on the gymnastic aspect of it, a little bit on the music as well. But to me, the emphasis there is how the Greek attitude towards life seems to be when they get to the end of this long struggle, it's not like they just immediately rush off to go sleep for a week or whatever. They decide to celebrate instead, which presumably would have included at least singing, along with the gymnastics that you're talking about. And one of the sayings that this reminds me of is Vatican saying 47, where it says, I've anticipated thee, fortune, and closed off every one of your devious entrances, and I won't give up myself as captive to thee or to any circumstance. But when it's time for us to go, spitting contempt on life and those who cling to it, maundering, we will leave from life, singing aloud a glorious triumph song on how well we lived. And to me, that is indicative of the Epicurean approach here. We're not just looking to escape from problems so that we can then go to sleep or rest as if that's the only thing that's important in life. We're looking to celebrate and achieve the enjoyment that comes from when we do successfully live life. DeWitt continues in the section that you've been talking about by joining it with a discussion that the objective of Platonic society had perhaps been the production of a good citizen, but what Epicurus's objective was to produce a happy and contented man. And DeWitt says, for practical purposes, this happiness was defined as health of mind and health of body, with the famous prayer for mens sana in corpore sano, a sound mind and a sound body, recommended by Juvenal as genuine Epicureanism. And while Juvenal may be a Roman and long after Epicurus lived, it's always seemed to me that DeWitt is getting the spirit here correct, that Epicurus was transferring the goal of life from being virtuous or being a good citizen or being a good subject of some supernatural God, to what he identified as the proper goal, which is what nature had intended, using pleasure and pain as the guides that nature's given to us, as living a happy life based on our experiences in life, not worrying about some life after death which doesn't exist, or worrying about some supernatural commandments, or worrying about some ideal forms or essences that don't exist, but following nature and the guidance of pleasure and pain. And that's what is contained in those words, health of mind and health of body. When your body is healthy, it feels good. When your mind is healthy, you're feeling good. And when I say good, of course, that's a generic word for saying you're experiencing pleasure of a type. So to me, the example of Xenophon and the Greeks escaping from that peril in Persia, again, and it also brings to mind the quote from Plutarch about how Epicurus said that we should look to the escape from some terrible danger and the feeling that arises in us after that as a way of identifying what the good is, rather than walking around ceaselessly debating the meaning of the word good. So that you look to real human experiences as the definition of what you're trying to do with your education and with your life.
Let me just say something about this quote by Juvenal. Just for context, the fuller quote goes like this. He says, "You should pray for a healthy mind in a healthy body. Ask for a stout heart that hath no fear of death, and deems length of days the least of nature's gifts, that can endure any kind of toil, that knows neither wrath nor desire, and thinks the woes and hard labors of Hercules better than the loves and banquets and downy cushions of Sardanapalus. What I commend to you, you can give to yourself, for assuredly the only road to a life of peace is virtue." There's a quote from Horace, which I've been looking for, in which he kind of, to my mind, takes Juvenal to task here. He says that it's not a healthy mind and a healthy body that I should pray for. Those are the things I can give myself, but that length of days is the only gift that it's proper to ask for. So an interesting twist on kind of a similar idea, that you don't need to pray for a healthy mind because part of the work is to establish it for yourself. So just an interesting dichotomy in the way you can look at it there. But I need to find the quote from Horace. And when I do, I'll put it in the show notes.
Okay. I seem to remember that maybe Thomas Jefferson adopted that issue of what you should pray for and what you should not pray for too, but I can't remember the detail of what he said. But when you read the full Juvenal quote, that clearly is not pure Epicureanism in total at all. It sounds like he's definitely got that Stoic vibe going on, at least in part of what he's saying. But,
well, it's funny because I can't think of anybody who wouldn't want a healthy mind and a healthy body. So,
well, but Joshua, yes, when you say that, I can't think of anyone who wouldn't want it either. But if virtue is your goal and virtue is the only thing that is important in life, and everything else is only instrumental at best, and you could be indifferent to everything other than virtue, then maybe the Stoics are going to be willing to dispute us on that. But I can't think of anybody who wouldn't want a healthy mind. I can't think of any sane person who would not want a healthy mind and a healthy body. So what DeWitt does in this first chapter before we go into his subheadings, but we've just been talking about music and geometry. DeWitt has also pointed out that the Platonic education included rhetoric, and then dialectic and mathematics, especially geometry. Rhetoric has always been something that I've been a little bit unclear about exactly what they're talking about. I know there's a Philodemus work on rhetoric, and I gather it's just sort of the art of using words for persuasion without really any major concern about what it is you're persuading people to do. Joshua, or anybody, how do you interpret rhetoric?
Yeah. I guess to master rhetoric, what you really want to master is the ability to speak persuasively contemporaneously about any particular issue. And I remember reading that in British education, this was given a quite important stature, with the idea that if you're going to raise a group of people who are going to later, serve in parliament, they need to be able to actually stand up and speak and express what they're trying to convince other people of. And so what they would do, based on my reading of British education at this indeterminate period, which I'm describing, is they would take cases from the ancient world, take cases from, like, for example, here's a sticky position that Demosthenes once found himself in. Now you have to stand up there and give me a speech in character as Demosthenes, counseling on what we should do in this terrible circumstance. A very difficult method of training, but the goal absolutely is to produce people who can speak persuasively off the cuff about anything. I think it would be fair to say that this is how Cicero probably made a name for himself in the Roman world, was his ability to do this and his accounts of his courts of law. For example, just as one case, when he busted open the Catiline conspiracy, that was one of them, wasn't it?
Yes.
But what it depends on is the ability to stand in front of a group and make your case in a way that will persuade the people that you're trying to convince, the people who have the power to make the decisions. In this case, going back to the book I mentioned earlier, The Anabasis by Xenophon, one of the things that's always constantly happening in that book is somebody is always standing up to give a speech.
Of course, being able to write or speak persuasively is probably at worst a neutral kind of talent to have. On page 108 of DeWitt's book, he cites Plutarch as saying, quote, "These men, Epicurus and his circle, write about oratory to deter us from becoming orators." And DeWitt's commentary is that you don't want to devote your life to leading the multitude because you're then tying yourself to the multitude. So you've got that aspect of it. It's not necessarily just that he's not interested in being persuasive in written or spoken word. It's just what it is he's using that for. And maybe the term rhetoric implies public speaking for purposes of the state or something like that. DeWitt says the tricks of the demagogue lose value and no quality of style is required except clarity when your purpose is an individual method of communication as opposed to politics.
Yeah, when you read Lucian in his Alexander the Oraclemonger, he makes it very clear that Alexander in that story was a very charming, very charismatic, very powerful public speaker, someone who could stand up and get a crowd on his side. But it wasn't a good thing that he could do that, right? It certainly wasn't to the benefit of the town that he lived in, that he had the ability to do that. All it meant in his case was that he was able to trick people more easily. Like a televangelist, I guess. I don't know.
The televangelist comparison comes up frequently in my mind as we discuss all these things. The opening of Lucretius about the threats of the priests, about death and torment everlasting, intended to confuse us and prevent us from understanding the truth of nature and so forth. You've got lots of easy comparisons with evangelical preachers of all sorts of different religions.
I can see why, for example, people might tend to agree with Epicurus that rhetoric should not be the focus of a school of philosophy. But where I expect to get pushback is particularly on these last two issues of dialectic and mathematics. I think that mathematics in our time period, in our culture, has attained to a state where it cannot be gainsaid. So it might be difficult for people to quite get a handle on what was going on with mathematics, and particularly with geometry in the ancient world. Because if you don't have that context, then Epicurus just frankly sounds like a moron, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. Somebody who doesn't believe in math. What do you think about a person like that? Well, it's not that he didn't accept the conclusions that you could draw using mathematical formula. It's that there were epistemological, ethical claims that were being made about nature, about human life, and the basis for these claims was a kind of misapplication of mathematics, and in particular geometry. It was the idea that, okay, if Euclid can prove, for example, that cone is 1/3 the volume of a cylinder or whatever it turns out to be, if he can do that using geometry, then maybe we can prove something about absolute truth using geometry. Maybe we can demonstrate something to be true about ideal forms using geometry. An example comes down to us from the Pythagorean school. Cassius, you have repeatedly used the word numerology to express this kind of sentiment, but it reaches very interesting heights in the Pythagorean school. They had the belief that 10 was the perfect number. And if 10 is the perfect number, then 10 must also be the number of the heavenly spheres. Now, how do we know that 10 is the perfect number? Well, if you have 1, that makes a point. If you have 2, that makes the segment of a line. If you have 3, that makes a triangle or a surface. And if you have 4, that makes a cube. So it gives you volume. So if you add up 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, that gives you 10. Now, it is true that 1 is a point, 2 is a line segment, 3 gives you a surface, 4 gives you volume. But the extra claim that they made that somehow, because you could add those things up and that would give you the number 10, the extra claim that therefore the number 10 is the perfect number is a claim that modern mathematics is not ever going to make, right? It's particularly this sort of, I don't want to say cultish, but this bizarre misapplication of mathematics in an attempt to find what we talked about in the last episode. How did that phrasing go? It was pure reason contemplating absolute truth. That's the goal of geometry in Plato's school. It's not just to find out interesting stuff. He's not trying to engineer a skyscraper. That's not a problem he's ever considered. He's trying to find out absolute truth, ethical truth, truth about nature, truth about the world we live in, about humans, about what happens to us when we die. He's trying to derive absolute truth from a system that, as I feel absolutely okay in saying, simply is incapable of giving that kind of proof or furnishing that kind of evidence or making that kind of argument. It's a misapplication, as I keep saying. So that's the version of mathematics that Epicurus in particular is trying to get away from.
Joshua, I think what you just said is a great summary for most of what we're talking about today, and especially just going back to the topic of Epicurus's attitude towards culture. Each of these words that we're talking about, whether it be culture or mathematics or geometry or rhetoric, we may have a superficial understanding or definition of that word today that makes us think that how can anybody disagree with any of those things? But at the time that Epicurus was working and writing and teaching, these words had much deeper connotations, and the claims being made on their behalf were much more extensive than what we're familiar with today. So rather than think that when Epicurus is rejecting something like mathematics, that he's just an idiot and we can't possibly accept anything else he says because he's so stupid, the better course and the direction the truth lies is going to be in exploring exactly what it is these terms meant and how Epicurus was reacting to them. While you were talking, I see on the rhetoric page at Wikipedia, the word rhetoric to us just sort of simply means the art of persuasive speaking. But one of the lines here in the Wikipedia page, rhetoric typically provides heuristics for understanding, discovering, and developing arguments for particular situations, such as Aristotle's 3 persuasive audience appeals: logos, pathos, and ethos. And if you hover over logos, you see a definition of logos as a term used in Western philosophy, psychology, and rhetoric, referring to the appeal to reason that relies on logic. Aristotle first systematized the use of the word, making it one of the 3 principles of rhetoric. And so in order to understand what Epicurus might have been referring to with rhetoric, you're going to have to get back into the details of, well, what were the 3 components of rhetoric in the ancient world and what was he possibly talking about, which is far beyond our ability to deal with in this episode of this podcast for sure. What we're doing today is just introducing the issue so that we can sort of set the stage for deeper discussion later on, and certainly for people who have the time and the ability to do more research on their own. We've talked about these issues of geometry, mathematics, and even rhetoric and music and poetry many times. Hopefully we've hammered in the point that we cannot take these issues superficially, and we have to understand what's going on and not let them worry us that this is some problem that Epicurus was not sufficiently as smart as we are today in the things that he was saying. He was dealing with these things on a much deeper level than we generally deal with today. But the issues that he's discussing, the issues that he's getting at, that's part of the benefit we get from Epicurean philosophy. By glossing over these things and taking these things for granted, we've been led down this primrose path of the rhetoricians who have produced in us an attitude towards life that has probably regressed significantly from Epicurus back 2,000 years ago. The first subsection of this chapter is entitled The Heavenly Apocalypse. And so let's talk about why DeWitt would segment that out. And part of this section is directed towards the method that's used in Lucretius of talking about casting the mind in a particular direction. This issue of a conceit, a methodology or method of approaching something, getting a higher view, maybe the cliche we use today, the 30,000 foot view of things. Obviously, we can't ascend to 30,000 feet. Most of us can't and see the world below us, but it's an issue of, for example, Plato had described apparently in the Phaedrus that the soul is described as ascending to the heavens in a chariot drawn by two steeds, and from a supernatural point of vantage, looking down upon the nature of things as they truly are. That's a method that's used, I think Cicero and uses that method, but it is brought to us in Lucretius in the very opening of Book 1 by the example of Epicurus traveling through the universe and coming back to us as a conqueror to explain the things that he had seen. Cicero used the conceit in his Dream of Scipio, where he has Scipio, I think, if I remember correctly, ascending over the earth and looking down at the earth below.
Okay, so under the Tour of the Universe section, he explains how this applies in the Epicurean system. He says, in order to make clear how this conceit of the ascent to the heaven integrates itself with the Epicurean system of knowledge, it is necessary to make a brief detour into the terminology of Greek geography and of Aristotle. And so he brings in words like periodeia and peregrinatio for journey. But it certainly is a tool that they seem to have used. What DeWitt points out here is that this is not at all uncommon. Even his predecessors in Greek philosophy used the same kind of thing. But Lucretius takes it to interesting heights in a passage that was actually misunderstood by Thoreau when he read it as being applied to Prometheus. And this is kind of the myth in Greek mythology for explaining this kind of phenomena. It's the idea that there is something heroic about going up and getting new information and bringing it back and giving it as a gift to other people. And in the story of Prometheus, he went up to Mount Olympus and stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. Now, the Epicureans don't have any time for that particular mythology. In fact, Lucretius, I think in Book 5, gives his own account as to how human beings first mastered fire. And it has to do with, I think he uses the example of, you see when lightning strikes, it might start fire in the forest. So now when you've worked out that you can make fire using wood and stuff, Lucretius is very clear that humankind begins not in the paradisal golden age, but in very primitive, very bleak conditions. And only by very slow degrees does it come up to something like the civilization that he was living in. So the Prometheus myth is not hugely helpful to them in that way. But as a metaphor for what they're trying to do in philosophy, he did seem to think it was helpful. And in the famous opening to Book 1, after the hymn to Venus, he says this: "A Greek it was who first opposing dared raise mortal eyes that terror to withstand, whom nor the fame of gods, nor lightning stroke, nor threatening thunder of the ominous sky abashed, but rather chafed to angry zest his dauntless head, to be the first to rend the crossbars at the gates of nature old, and thus his will and hearty wisdom won, and forward thus he fared afar beyond the flaming ramparts of the world, until he wandered the immeasurable all, and, as it will go on to say, brought back news of what can be and what cannot." Of course, he's not physically going up in space. I don't think that has to be said. There is a very interesting story by Lucian, considered to be the first science fiction story, where they do actually take a ship to space. But this is a journey in thought. Touring the universe in thought seems to be the general idea. Alfred Tennyson put it this way in his poem Ulysses, which is written from the point of view of Odysseus at the end of his life. He says, "Life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence something more, a bringer of new things. And vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit, yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought." So that gives you an idea of the practice, which has continued to inspire poets all throughout history. Horace actually sees this as being maybe not, I guess, in the context of knowing that you're going to die, that this represents a kind of ambition that doesn't serve you well in the end, because he says in one of his odes, "You who measured the sea, the earth, and the numberless sands, you, Archytas, are now confined in a small mound of dirt near the Matine shore. And what good does it do you that you attempted the mansions of the skies, and that you traversed the round celestial vault, you with a soul born to die?"
That's the poet, I guess, there, focusing on the end of the journey and the inevitability of death as the thing to say, as opposed to the pleasure that was no doubt experienced during the course of the journey.
Yeah, this is Horace writing at a particularly interesting time in his life. In the early work of Horace, we see a distinct Epicurean note. In fact, he says in one of his letters, he says, "When you look for me, you shall find me, fat and sleek, a hog out of Epicurus's herd." So it's maybe unclear as to what extent he's genuinely adopting the name for himself, but there are points of interest in his early work that do suggest an interest in Epicureanism. But that all changed with the fallout from the Roman Civil War, because the other side won and the other side established an empire in which they ruled by divine right. And so this creates a problem, of course, for Horace. If you want to continue to live, you need to pay lip service to Augustus Caesar, which includes the Roman state religion, which is part of how the empire concentrated power. The exact moment when he abandoned Epicureanism is actually preserved as well in one of the odes, which is written around the same period. He says, "Once I wandered, an expert in crazy wisdom." This is translated by A.S. Klein. Crazy wisdom is how he describes Epicurean philosophy. "A scant and infrequent adorer of the gods. Now I'm forced to set sail and return, to go back to the paths I abandoned. For Jupiter, father of all the gods, who generally splits the clouds with his lightning, flashing away, drove thundering horses and swift chariot through the clear sky." This is a direct repudiation of Lucretius. Lucretius said, if lightning and thunder were the armaments of Zeus, then why do we only see them when the sky is in storm? In other words, you don't see lightning, you don't hear thunder on a clear day. Why do lightning bolts strike the temples of Olympian Zeus himself? Why does he waste his bolts with such fecundity in places where the humans don't even live, in deserts and over the sea? It seems to be a huge waste and a huge amount of trouble and labor apart from anything else. But Horace, who perhaps he actually did see lightning, hear thunder on a clear day, more probably he's using this to repudiate Epicurean philosophy in a time in his life when it has become inconvenient to be an Epicurean.
Gosh, Joshua, there's a lot of great detail in what you just had to say there, a significant part of which is new to me. I was generally aware of the situation that as Horace got older, he was less Epicurean. I don't think I was aware of that particular quote that you mentioned. So there's a lot of good research that could be done in Horace's Epicureanism. It certainly strikes me as parallel to what Cicero was going through towards the end of his life as his daughter died and circumstances were getting negative. He became apparently much more anti-Epicurean than he had been earlier. So it's a subject for many years of discussion, how adversity brings out maybe the worst, or it certainly presses you for the sincerity of your belief. And there are many people, I think Lucretius talks about it, how as you face adversity or face death, the people who have not properly or been able to prepare for it in some way, that's when the truth comes to the surface and you see people revert to superstitious ways as what they see perhaps sadly as their only escape from whatever problem they're facing. And of course, I do understand that Horace had been allied with the senatorial forces of maybe even Pompey, and certainly after Cassius and Brutus were defeated at Philippi, things would have been bleak for him afterwards. But I wish I had more information about those details. And what you just quoted is what amounts to a repudiation later in life of his earlier views. Fascinating stuff to talk about.
Just while we're on the subject, the one quote that I can think of from Cicero that kind of describes what you were just talking about, he says, I don't know where, If I err in my belief that the souls of men are immortal, then I err gladly, and I would not have this belief stripped from me while I'm still alive. So in other words, it's so important to him to believe that there is a life beyond the grave, that even if he's wrong, he doesn't want to know it. He doesn't want to know that he's wrong. You mentioned the grief over the death of his daughter, and that certainly has an impact. It's also suggestive when you consider that in the Torquatus material, he specifically says that his desire is to find truth and not to confound, as it were, an opponent. But you have to consider everyone has their biases, and Cicero's no different. I think we covered that when we went through the Torquatus material, which was very interesting.
Some really interesting historical stuff we could talk about. I guess we should try to bring this back to the issue of education, and maybe I can link those two things together there by saying that the things that you go through with life and then you face traumatic events with death as time goes by, you're just not going to be prepared for that unless you have thought about death, thought about these things for significant periods of time. If you lived your whole life believing in some supernatural religion and the issues that we talk about all the time, there's numbers of references, it seems like, in the Epicurean material that you should learn these things early in life and then continuously talk about them and think about them, because when these bad time comes, you need to be prepared. And if you're not prepared, it's very easy to just have your reason confounded by people who want to manipulate you into supernatural beliefs and as a way out, and all sorts of manipulative behavior, let's say, that it's easy to place your faith in someone else or some other idea if you're not sufficiently prepared yourself to understand, and always be looking out for these attractive but not necessarily true alternative viewpoints. And another way to maybe bring this even further back, it seems to me that if you unite the subheadings here that DeWitt's talking about in terms of the heavenly apocalypse and the tour of the universe, I would see this as him suggesting that, again, it's not a matter in studying philosophy of just going from flower to flower to flower and discrete issue to discrete issue to discrete issue and never joining the observations that you make into a more systematized view. And the analogy of a more systematized view of everything is just fly up into space, fly up above the earth and see everything from a much higher vantage point, such as you can do from a mountaintop, for example, as well. The issue is that you have to be able to integrate the things that you've seen into a worldview so that when new things occur to you, you can fit them into this paradigm. So that the heavenly viewpoint, and then of the tour of the universe. I recently took a trip to a place that I'd been before. I was with somebody who had not been to that location before. And I continuously see this issue of a guide as being a good analogy for what he's talking about. Epicurean philosophy is not saying that there's a God who's speaking to you surreptitiously through divine revelation. You're not going to learn the truth of the universe through geometry or mathematics. But what you do need is some type of method of grasping where you are and where you're going. And an analogy is a map. An analogy is having a guide. Epicurus is not a channel of divine revelation from God. He's not delivering to you a supernatural method of understanding things through mathematics. He's being a guide of things that he's explored already and that he's seen before and processed in his own mind. And he's acclimating you along the way, along a path, guiding you. And people have the ability to stop. They have the ability to go in a different direction. He's not, again, enlisting people or followers as a dictator. He's a guide imparting information that hopefully you find useful in your own path through these same issues. So that the guide analogy is more than just a superficial analogy. I think it's really a way of organizing the educational process where the teacher is not somebody to be accepted solely on their authority, to be accepted without challenge. He's a guide who's been there all the way through, though. You can make your own observations and decide whether you embrace them or not.
He says on the bottom of page 110 here, that the Greek word periodos, like the Latin term itinerarium, means not only a tour or a journey from place to place, but also a map or a guidebook. So very much central to what you're talking about. And also to the other point you often make, Cassius, which is that the map is not the territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't worship the map. You don't worship Epicurus. You don't take any of it as an absolute authority, but you sure as heck do find it useful and helpful. And any step along the way where you find that some territory you're in doesn't agree with the map, then you're going to acknowledge that maybe the map needs to be updated, and you're going to go with what the reality is in front of you. But the person who would say that maps are useless or maps should be thrown out and that no mapping is possible, no knowledge of anything is possible, that's just as big an error, if not worse of an error. That's the absolute skepticism that people can fall into. The nihilism that they can fall into after they realize that their supernatural views really have no foundation. There's this pendulum that seems to swing back and forth from supernatural beliefs and belief in absolutes from another world. And then when you realize in a difficult situation, like maybe Horace was facing, or like maybe Cicero was facing, that those ideas and those attitudes that you've had may not prove to be true, you either swing back into just total despair and nihilism, or you grab onto those dreams even harder. And neither one of those approaches are the correct one, I think, from Epicurus' perspective.
There's one more thing involved in this whole tour of the universe issue, which is probably implied by what I read from Lucretius, but it has to do with having a sense of wonder in the face of these amazing things that you're being presented with. Atomism you can understand as something sterile, something lifeless, something that takes all of the mystery out of nature, in much the same way as John Keats accused Isaac Newton of unweaving the rainbow. But there is a sense of wonder in the way things actually do work. When the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, came back down, he remarked, I think rather snidely, "I didn't see any God up there." That for me does not set anything like the right kind of tone for the first man in space. What I want to see from you is a sense of the wonder, the sense of human achievement that has taken place here, and the sense of the impenetrable, incomprehensible majesty of the nature that surrounds us, which is far more satisfying to my mind than what we actually got from him. But that's just by the by.
What was said about wonder, that comes up in Lucretius, is that correct? Is there any other places in Epicureanism that talks about having a sense of wonder?
Joshua, think about what the full answer is. Certainly the main example that always comes to my mind is the section in Lucretius where he talks about looking up at the sky and realizing how grand and amazing it is, and realizing that people get jaded and cynical and they don't look up at the sky anymore, and they get used to everything and they want something new all the time, even though what's there before them is grand and amazing as it is. There's definitely that section. I don't know if there's others or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would make the argument that Lucretius has this kind of all over, the project of writing 7,000 lines of hexameter. You don't do that if you don't find something almost entrancing about it. But certainly there's one of the proems, is that the one to book 4 maybe, where he describes his experience as a poet writing the poem, and that he's doing something that had never been done before, and that it's like the most pleasurable thing he's ever experienced, the way he describes it.
Yeah, that's the Pierian Springs or something like that he's the first to quaff the waters of this springs, and how significant and emotional an experience this is for him.
Yeah.
So that wonder issue is definitely there.
Yeah, it seems like in Epicurus' own words, it'd be hard to come up with a direct example of that.
Possibly something in Diogenes Laertius and his comments about what the wise man is able to do might go in the same direction, but I'm not thinking of a good example. But definitely it's so clear in Lucretius, and that's got to be a reflection of Epicurus' views. I'm not sure about Philodemus, but it goes right along with just the whole issue of pleasure being the central aspect of life, pleasure being a feeling. Certainly there's the quote in Diogenes Laertius about the wise man is going to experience emotion more deeply than other men. This whole issue of engaging emotionally with existence as it is, as opposed to how you would prefer it to be or how you would like to dream it to be, I would think is absolutely central to the whole philosophy. Because that's what life is about, is the experience of sensation. And once you have no more sensation, once you get no reaction to anything anymore, that's the equivalent of, or the definition of, death. And of course, joined with that comment in Lucretius about the wonder of looking up at the sky, I'm pretty sure that's where it continues on and says that this is a new philosophy, but it's calling out to you to examine it and to think about it and to embrace it if it's true. And if you find it's not true, to fight against it. But that you should not reject something just because it's new, nor should you think that newness is the only thing in life. That's the issue about being jaded. We do get jaded when we think that the sky becomes ordinary, but if we just look up at it and think about it and really truly experience it, we lose that cynicism, or we should lose that cynicism. Not everybody does, and maybe that's one of the problems and issues that we're dealing with, is how you get cynical and how you lose your enjoyment of life, and that you should not do that. Joshua?
Yeah, you're saying that quote about the stars is in Lucretius?
Yes, absolutely. If I was quick enough to find it now, it'd be good to talk about it and read it. I think of the Humphreys edition mainly.
Because let me read something to you by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is the quote that sticks in my head.
Okay.
He says, "If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown? But every night come out these envoys of beauty and light the universe with their admonishing smile."
Okay, now that is almost directly a takeoff of what I'm remembering from Lucretius. And almost enough to joke about considering plagiarism there, except I feel so sure it's so clear to him that he intended to copy it that he would expect people to understand his allusion. This is the way Rolf Humphreys translates it. Direct your mind to a true system. Here is something new for ear and eye. Nothing is ever so easy but what at first is difficult to trust. Nothing is great and marvelous but what all men, a little at a time, begin to mitigate their sense of awe. Look up at the pure bright color of the sky, the wheeling stars, the moon, the shining sun. If all these, all of a sudden, should arise for the first time before our mortal sight, what could be called more wonderful, more beyond the heights to which aspiring mind might dare? Nothing, I think. And yet a sight like this, marvelous as it is, now draws no man to lift his gaze to heaven's bright areas. We are a jaded lot. But even so, don't be too shocked by something new, too scared to use your reasoning sense, to weigh and balance, so that if in the end a thing seems true, you welcome it with open arms. If false, you do your very best to strike it down.
Yeah, we're talking about the issue of wonder and where it shows up in Epicurean philosophy, and particularly as it relates to this tour of the universe idea. And when you told me about that quote, what I immediately thought of was this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, probably my first major literary interest in my adolescent and adult life was American transcendentalism. So if nothing else, I have a store of quotations locked away for forever and ever. But what Emerson says is this: if the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown? But every night come out these envoys of beauty and light the universe with their admonishing smile. I don't know if Emerson did read Lucretius. It's possible that there is a connection between these two passages.
Well, it's pretty easy to think multiple people totally independently would come up with it, but it is a very good illustration, I think, of the point that we don't even think about the stars as we go through our daily lives and the way we live today. We hardly even look up at them at all. And of course, there's lately been a whole series of new, incredibly brilliant pictures from I think they call it the James Webb Space Telescope or something like that. That's even better than the Hubble pictures that were out there for some years, that are just dramatically amazing to look at the configuration of the stars.
Yeah, the pictures are incredibly sharp. When you compare a Hubble picture of one area and the James Webb picture of the same area or a similar, the difference in resolution is astonishing.
Well, we're probably at a position where we need to come to the close for this episode, but I think Calasini's question about the wonder aspect is a really good place to end it, from the perspective that this is not just something that should be dry and unemotional and calculating in an abstract logical sense of the word, that ultimately in Epicurean philosophy, it's the feeling and the emotions of life that define what life really is, and that we should approach these issues We should try to get the big picture in our minds. If you use the example of a tour guide or just going up into the air or on a mountaintop and looking at the scenery below you and begin to realize how everything fits together and how the proper reaction to this is not just to despair or to close your mind to it or go to sleep, but to embrace the majesty, the amazing aspects of being alive for the time that you are alive.
It's particularly important, Cassius, because most of us are well past what is being described in this chapter, which is kind of the period of formal schooling, I guess you could call it. And there needs to be compelling reasons to take time out of your very busy life to devote to something like the study of a system of philosophy from the ancient world. It has to be compelling.
And that reminds me of what we've been talking about today. If you don't take the time to understand this and work on it, you're going to end up like a Cicero, hopefully not with your tongue cut out and your head cut off, but you're going to be despairing at the end of your life. You're going to end up like, apparently, to some extent, Horace was. You're going to be tempted to backslide into these areas of superstition that are basically are borderline aspects of despairing of your situation. Of course, the example throughout Lucretius, you have people who end up taking their own lives totally unjustifiably out of fear of death and the fear of these things that they've never come to terms with. I think Epicurus is pointing the way here. It's not any amount of words, it's not any amount of logical construct that can give you the emotional intensity to stand up to these issues and to embrace your life and to avoid falling into despair. It's not just the sun's rays itself that can lead you to understand these things. You've got to apply your mind and apply your understanding of what it is you're observing and engage with it. It's not a dry mental construct. I'm talking as if I'm about to say goodbye, but Joshua, you haven't had closing thoughts. And of course, if anyone else has any closing thoughts for today, let's say them too. Joshua?
Yeah, we were trying to keep it light until you slipped in suicide there.
I always seem to come back to that as an interesting issue.
But no, I don't have anything else. So briefly, we should tell them what we've just realized, which is we have one more episode on this issue of education, particularly specifically on the issue of the books. And then we're getting into epistemology, I think it is.
Right. So we have lots more detail coming in future episodes. And of course, I never miss the opportunity. We've had this discussion on the forum this very week in an interesting thread. Never miss the opportunity to say that any discussion of suicide is just absolutely the last thing that anybody wants to pursue and should consider. It's out there as the fact that we're not afraid of death, that life can hold no terror for people who understand that death holds no terror. So you've got this constant understanding that's out there. But unless you're in some extremely unusual circumstance, like maybe Cassius Longinus just having lost a big battle at Philippi and thinking he's about to be tortured by the oncoming enemy, you're just generally not going to consider ending your own life as a reasonable option for you to pursue. Those are going to be just very unusual circumstances. But death is a part of life to an extent. It's something we all have to come to terms with. And we have to come to terms at some point in the future. We're going to confront it and we need to think about how we're going to face it. But everything is tied up in life itself. Whether Norman DeWitt is correct that life itself is the ultimate goal of Epicurus as opposed to pleasure is beside the point. There is no doubt that only the living can experience pleasure. And so you hold on to life as long as it makes sense to you to hold on to it so that you can experience that. All right. Okay. So with that, as the first half of the chapter on the new education will come to a close today, and we'll come back next week to continue on in Epicurus and His Philosophy. Thank you very much. And if you have any comments or questions in the meantime, please always drop by the forum and let us know what they are. We'll see you soon. Goodbye.